The morning of November 7th, 1943, dawned cold and grey over the English Channel. Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron throttled back his Pratt & Whitney R-2-800 engine, watching the fuel gauge needles sink toward empty with growing alarm. Behind him, somewhere in the murk over occupied France, his flight leader had gone down. Ahead, through breaks in the clouds, he could see what looked like a friendly airfield, the familiar pattern of a grass strip with scattered aircraft. He committed to his approach. The massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, serial number 42-22490, nicknamed Beetle, touched down smoothly on the grass. Roach followed a ground vehicle to a parking area, shut down his engine, and only then noticed the Balkenkreuz on nearby aircraft. Germans surrounded his cockpit with rifles drawn. His war as a combat pilot was over. But for German fighter pilots, an education in American firepower was about to begin in ways that would shake their understanding of aerial warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Luftwaffe engineers and pilots discovered when they examined and flew Beetle would fundamentally challenge everything they believed about fighter armament. The P-47 carried 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, 8 heavy weapons that together could deliver over 9 pounds of lead per second into a target. This wasn't just more guns than German fighters carried. This represented a completely different philosophy of aerial combat, one built on overwhelming firepower rather than elegant efficiency. Over the next 18 months, as German pilots methodically tested captured Thunderbolts at Rechlin and demonstrated them to frontline units through the Zirkus Rosarius program, they would confront an uncomfortable reality. American fighter design didn't prioritize agility or speed alone. It prioritized the ability to destroy any target in seconds through sheer volume of fire. And against this philosophy, German fighters, with their mixed armament of lighter machine guns and slower-firing cannons, were fundamentally outmatched in firepower. The capture of William Roach's P-47 on November 7, 1943, was not the first time the Luftwaffe had encountered the Thunderbolt in combat. German pilots had been fighting the massive American fighter since April of 1943, when the 4th Fighter Group first escorted B-17 bombers into hostile airspace over occupied Europe. Initial combat reports from Luftwaffe fighter units reflected confusion about this new adversary. The American fighter was absurdly large for a single-engine aircraft, sluggish at low altitudes, and apparently flown by pilots who avoided traditional turning dogfights. German pilots, accustomed to the nimble Focke-Wulf 4190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109, initially dismissed the Thunderbolt as an inferior design. But buried within those same combat reports were troubling details that contradicted the narrative of American inferiority. Pilots described how Thunderbolts that chose to disengage could not be caught once they entered a dive. They mentioned devastating firepower when the Americans did choose to engage. They noted armor protection that seemed impervious to standard 7.92mm rounds, and often resisted even 20mm cannon fire. Most disturbingly, they reported that badly damaged Thunderbolts continued flying, limping back to England with battle damage that would have destroyed any German fighter. Damaged P-47s routinely returned to base missing sections of wings, with engines streaming oil, with control surfaces shot away, yet still under pilot control. When Lieutenant Roach's intact Thunderbolt rolled to a stop at the Luftwaffe airfield at Caen, German intelligence officers immediately recognized the opportunity. This was the first complete, undamaged example of the American fighter they had captured. Within hours, Beetle was surrounded by armed guards to prevent sabotage. American markings were swiftly painted over with German Balkenkreuz on wings and fuselage, and bright yellow identification paint was applied to undersurfaces and tail surfaces. This yellow paint, designated RLM-04, was standard Luftwaffe practice for all captured aircraft to prevent friendly fire from German anti-aircraft gunners. Arrangements were quickly made to transfer the aircraft to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier testing facility located approximately 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin. The aircraft received the designation 7+9 at Rechlin, then later T9 plus FK when it joined the Zirkus Rosarius evaluation unit. The Zirkus Rosarius, commanded by Flugkapitän Theodor Rosarius, was a special Luftwaffe unit tasked with testing captured Allied aircraft and touring frontline fighter bases to familiarize German pilots with enemy capabilities. Hans Werner Lerche, the principal test pilot and chief engineer at Rechlin, was assigned to conduct the initial evaluation flights. Lerche would ultimately fly over 125 different aircraft types during the war, without ever crashing or seriously damaging a single aircraft, a safety record that spoke to his methodical professionalism. He approached the P-47 with appropriate caution given the aircraft's unfamiliar systems and enormous size. His first impression, documented in his logbook and later published in his memoirs, reflected surprise at the cockpit's complexity. The instrument panel contained what seemed like twice the number of gauges found in German fighters. Strange levers controlled systems Lerche had never encountered. The turbo supercharger system required understanding of exhaust flow management principles that were theoretical in German aviation circles, but apparently standard practice in American designs. The constant speed propeller operated differently from German equivalents. Most confusing was the elaborate system of automatic engine management that German pilots handled manually through constant throttle and mixture adjustments. Lerche spent considerable time on the ground experimenting with controls and studying the layout before attempting flight. The engine start sequence alone revealed sophistication beyond standard German practice. The Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double Wasp required specific procedures to properly initialize the massive turbo supercharger system. When the 18-cylinder radial engine roared to life, it produced a sound utterly different from German engines. This was a deep, powerful rumble that spoke of enormous displacement and tremendous power reserves. Lerche taxied carefully, feeling the weight of the aircraft through the controls. The P-47 weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, and this example still carried substantial fuel and full ammunition load, bringing it closer to 13,500 pounds. For comparison, the Tupolev 190A8, one of Germany's heaviest single-seat fighters, weighed approximately 7,650 pounds empty and roughly 10,800 pounds at maximum loaded weight. The Thunderbolt was genuinely massive for a single-seat fighter. He advanced the throttle for takeoff, and the difference between German and American engineering philosophy became immediately apparent. The R2-800 developed 2,000 horsepower at standard boost settings, with war emergency power reaching 2,300 horsepower when using water methanol injection. Germany's BMW 801D, the finest radial engine in German production, and the power plant of the 4190, produced between 1,700 and 1,730 horsepower at maximum continuous power settings. Even with this power advantage, the P-47's greater weight meant the takeoff run was longer than Lerche expected. But once airborne, he began discovering why German pilots who had fought Thunderbolts only at low altitude had fundamentally misunderstood the aircraft's capabilities. He climbed steadily, nursing the turbo supercharger to operating temperature as altitude increased. Below 15,000 feet, the P-47 felt exactly as German combat pilots had described: heavy, sluggish in turns, unable to match German fighters in maneuverability. The rate of climb was mediocre compared to the 4190 or Bf-109. At this altitude range, any competent German pilot in a contemporary fighter could outmaneuver the Thunderbolt in sustained turning combat. But somewhere above 20,000 feet, the character of the aircraft transformed completely. The turbo supercharger, driven by exhaust gases and becoming increasingly efficient as air pressure decreased with altitude, began forcing massive quantities of compressed air into the engine cylinders. While German engines gasped for oxygen and lost power as altitude increased, the R2-800 maintained full rated output. At 25,000 feet, where German fighters were operating at perhaps 70% of their sea-level power, the Thunderbolt's engine was still producing full rated output. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lerche pushed the throttle forward at 25,000 feet and felt the Thunderbolt accelerate with surprising vigor. He rolled into a dive to test high-speed characteristics, and the aircraft responded with enthusiasm. The P-47 accelerated past 500 miles per hour in a steep dive, reaching speeds where the controls stiffened dramatically as airflow compressed around the airframe. The roll rate impressed Lerche immediately. Despite its size and weight, the Thunderbolt could roll faster than any German fighter he had flown, including the TMW-190, which was considered excellent in roll performance. This characteristic, combined with its devastating dive speed, created a tactical advantage that German pilots had been reporting without fully understanding. An American pilot in trouble at high altitude could simply roll inverted and dive away at speeds no German fighter could match. Over the following weeks, Rechlin's engineers subjected Beetle to exhaustive testing. They photographed every component, they measured every dimension, they weighed every major part, they tested every system under various conditions. But the aspect of the P-47 that generated the most professional shock among German evaluators was not the engine or the turbo supercharger or the armor protection. It was the armament system, the sheer overwhelming firepower that 850 caliber Browning machine guns could deliver. The armament installation received intense scrutiny from German weapons specialists. The P-47 mounted 8 Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing. German fighters of the period typically carried mixed armament. The FOF-190A typically mounted 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns in the engine cowling and 2 or 4 20mm MG-151 cannons in the wing roots, with some variants adding 2 more 20mm cannons in underwing pods. The Bf-109 typically carried 2 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns in the cowling, and 1 20mm MG-151 cannon firing through the propeller spinner, with some variants adding 2 more 20mm cannons in underwing pods. The American decision to install 8 heavy machine guns represented a deliberate choice that German designers found difficult to comprehend. Why not mix machine guns and cannons for different tactical situations? Why accept the weight of 8 identical weapons when a lighter, more varied armament might serve multiple roles? The answer lay in American tactical philosophy and, more fundamentally, in American industrial capability. Each 50 caliber Browning M2 was fed from a separate ammunition box built into the wing structure. Each box contained up to 425 rounds. Total ammunition capacity was 3,400 rounds across all 8 guns. For direct comparison, the FO-190A typically carried approximately 2,000 rounds total for its machine guns and 500 rounds total for its cannons. The P-47 pilot could fire all 8 guns continuously for approximately 20 seconds before exhausting ammunition. When all 8 guns were properly harmonized to converge at a single point in space, the combined rate of fire approached 100 rounds per second. Captain Shiro Tanaka, the Luftwaffe weapons specialist assigned to evaluate the system, supervised firing tests at Rechlin's gunnery range. The results were documented in detailed technical reports that would later circulate through the Luftwaffe's fighter commands. 8 guns firing simultaneously, Tanaka wrote in his preliminary assessment, deliver approximately 9 pounds of projectiles per second to the target area. The concentration of fire is devastating. In a 5-second firing pass, the P-47 places approximately 500 heavy bullets into a 3-foot by 3-foot target area at 1,100 feet range. This volume of fire can destroy enemy aircraft through kinetic impact alone, even without explosive rounds. German test firings of the captured aircraft's armament system documented the devastating effect. The installation quality impressed German armament specialists who examined the systems. Each gun was mounted in an electrically heated bay to prevent freezing at high altitude, where temperatures could drop to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Spent cartridge cases and disintegrating belt links were collected through chutes and ejected through ports in the wing's lower surface, preventing them from damaging the aircraft or interfering with control surfaces. The system functioned flawlessly during Rechlin testing, firing thousands of rounds under varying atmospheric conditions, with no jamming or feeding malfunctions recorded. Ammunition quality also revealed another dimension of American industrial capability. The 50 caliber rounds used armor-piercing cores manufactured to consistent specifications, incendiary compounds that functioned reliably, and tracer elements that burned predictably. Testing revealed that American ammunition was consistently more reliable than equivalent German production, which had suffered quality degradation as strategic materials became scarce and manufacturing standards declined under wartime pressures. The 50 caliber Browning M2 round itself represented a significant advance in aerial weaponry. Each cartridge measured nearly 5.5 inches long. The projectile weighed approximately 43 grams and travelled at nearly 880 meters per second, carrying enormous kinetic energy. The armor-piercing round could defeat nearly an inch of face-hardened steel at 200 yards. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds, typically weighing 647 to 662 grains, were most useful against aircraft, as they could penetrate enemy armor and engine blocks, sever airframe components, and ignite fuel tanks. German pilots who viewed demonstration firings at Rechlin came away visibly shaken. The sound alone was impressive. 8 heavy machine guns firing in unison created a distinctive, hammering roar that could be heard for miles. But the visual impact was more profound. Tracer rounds from 8 guns converging on a single point created what looked like a solid stream of fire. Target drones used in live fire exercises were literally torn apart by the volume of fire. Armored panels meant to simulate enemy fighter protection were perforated like paper. Lieutenant Hans Hartmann, a 190 pilot with 17 victories who attended one of the Rechlin demonstrations, later wrote in his combat diary about the experience. "I watched the captured Thunderbolt fire at a target drone from 400 meters. The drone simply disintegrated. Not damaged, not crippled. Disintegrated. One moment it was flying, the next it was falling debris. I thought of the times I had attacked American bombers and seen their defensive fire. I thought of the times I had fired my cannons at Thunderbolts and watched them absorb hits and continue flying. Now I understood. They build aircraft to survive what they know they can deliver." The comparison to German fighter armament revealed a fundamental philosophical divide. German fighters relied on mixed armament that theoretically provided flexibility. The lighter 7.92mm or 13mm machine guns could be used for ranging shots and against lightly protected targets. The heavier 20mm or 30mm cannons provided destructive power against bombers or heavily armored fighters. This mixed approach required German pilots to manage different weapons with different ballistic characteristics, different rates of fire, and different ammunition capacities. The P-47's uniform armament simplified fire control dramatically. All 8 guns had identical ballistic characteristics. All fired at similar rates. All had similar ammunition capacity. An American pilot aimed once and pressed the trigger, knowing that 8 weapons would deliver their fire to the same point simultaneously. There was no need to manage different weapons or calculate different trajectories. Moreover, the volume of fire compensated for pilot error and target maneuvering. German pilots firing cannons needed precise aim because each cannon shell was precious, with limited ammunition capacity. Missing meant wasting scarce rounds. American pilots firing 8 machine guns simultaneously could afford to be less precise because the sheer volume of projectiles created a beaten zone large enough to ensure hits even if aim was imperfect. The tactical implications troubled Luftwaffe combat instructors who studied the Rechlin reports. American fighter tactics, they realized, were optimized around this firepower advantage. American pilots were taught to make slashing attacks from positions of advantage, fire a brief burst from all 8 guns, and disengage immediately. They didn't need to maneuver for perfect shooting position because their overwhelming firepower made adequate position sufficient. They didn't need to press attacks home to point-blank range because their weapons were effective at greater distances than German fighter armament. German pilots, by contrast, needed to maneuver into optimal firing position to make their limited cannon ammunition count. They needed to close to shorter ranges, where cannons were most effective. They needed to maintain fire discipline, because running out of ammunition meant returning to base defenseless. These requirements forced German pilots to take greater risks and spend more time in vulnerable positions while maneuvering for shots. By mid-December of 1943, Rechlin's preliminary assessment of the captured P-47's armament system was complete. The conclusions, carefully worded to avoid accusations of defeatism, nevertheless painted a disturbing picture. The report noted that American fighter firepower exceeded German fighter firepower by a factor of approximately 2-to-1 in terms of projectile weight delivered per second. It observed that American ammunition reliability appeared superior to German production. It documented that the uniform armament simplified fire control and improved hit probability. Most significantly, the report concluded that replicating such an armament system in German fighters would prove difficult given current industrial constraints. Installing 8 heavy machine guns required substantial ammunition storage capacity, necessitating larger wing structures with greater internal volume. The guns themselves, while conceptually simple, required precision manufacturing and quality control that German small arms production struggled to achieve consistently by late 1943. The ammunition production alone would strain resources already stretched impossibly thin supplying existing weapons. But the tactical assessments that accompanied the technical reports cut deeper. German fighter pilots, the reports noted, had developed tactics optimized around their existing armament. They maneuvered aggressively to achieve optimal firing position because their weapons demanded precision. They closed to short range because their cannons were most effective at close quarters. They pressed attacks because their limited ammunition required them to make every shot count. Against opponents with similar armament, these tactics had proven effective for years. Against the P-47's overwhelming firepower, these tactics increasingly resembled suicide. American pilots didn't need to maneuver into optimal position. They didn't need to close to short range. They didn't need to press attacks. They could fire from adequate position at adequate range, deliver devastating volumes of fire in seconds, and disengage before German pilots could respond. The firepower imbalance transformed what had been fair fights into systematic attrition. The testing program continued through the winter of 1943 and into early 1944. On May 29, 1944, another P-47 landed in German hands when 2nd Lieutenant Lloyd S. Hathcock of the 301st Fighter Squadron, 332nd Fighter Group, became disoriented during a ferry flight and mistakenly landed at the enemy-held Rome Littorio airfield in Italy. His aircraft, serial number 42-75971, had previously been the personal mount of George Novotny, an 8 Victory Ace. The Germans transferred this second P-47 to Rechlin, where it received the designation 8+6, then later transferred it to Zirkus Rosarius on October 12, 1944, where it received the designation T9+LK. The testing data accumulated at Rechlin produced tactical recommendations that were compiled and distributed to frontline Luftwaffe fighter units. These recommendations advised that engaging P-47s below 15,000 feet offered the best probability of success, as the Thunderbolt's poor low-altitude performance and slow rate of climb gave German fighters clear advantages in that regime. Pilots were specifically warned to avoid diving away from attacking Thunderbolts, as the American fighter would simply accelerate to speeds that German aircraft could not match. The reports emphasized that damaged P-47s frequently continued flying despite battle damage that would destroy German fighters, so attacks needed to be pressed home aggressively with concentrated fire. But most importantly for German pilots, the tactical advice stressed the overwhelming firepower disadvantage they faced. Avoid head-on attacks against P-47s, the reports warned. 850 caliber machine guns firing head-on will destroy your aircraft before your weapons can achieve effective hits. If you must engage, attack from oblique angles where the concentration of American fire is reduced. Disengage immediately after your first firing pass. Do not attempt to turn fight with damaged Thunderbolts, as their pilots may draw you into range of their devastating firepower while you maneuver for position. The tactical advice, however useful to individual pilots, could not address the fundamental strategic problem. Germany was fighting an opponent with effectively unlimited material resources relative to German industrial capacity. Every damaged or destroyed P-47 was replaced within days from production that exceeded 300 aircraft per month at peak output. American pilot training programs produced skilled aviators in quantities Germany could no longer match. The logistics system supporting American operations delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts without apparent constraint, while German logistics deteriorated under relentless Allied air attack. The captured P-47s were eventually transferred to the Wonder Zirkus Rosarius, the special Luftwaffe demonstration unit commanded by Flugkapitän Theodor Rosarius. This specialized unit traveled to frontline fighter bases throughout occupied Europe, allowing German pilots to see captured Allied aircraft firsthand and learn recognition features and combat characteristics. The demonstrations served dual purposes, both educational and psychological. Pilots learned the visual recognition features and tactical characteristics of enemy aircraft they would face in combat, but they also saw physical evidence that Allied equipment was often superior to their own in specific important capabilities. The 850 caliber machine guns, mounted in the P-47's wings, represented firepower that no German single-engine fighter could match. When Rosarius's pilots demonstrated the armament system by firing at ground targets, the effect was visible for miles. The concentrated fire from 8 heavy weapons could destroy trucks, damage tanks, and obliterate soft targets in seconds. Luftwaffe pilot Walter Wolfram, who had the opportunity to fly captured P-47s during the demonstrations, later recalled his impressions. During the war, I had the opportunity to fly captured P-47s and P-51s. I didn't like the Thunderbolt. It was too big. The cockpit was immense and unfamiliar. After so many hours in the snug and confines of the 109, everything felt out of reach and too far away from the pilot. But I will admit that sitting behind 850 caliber machine guns gave one a sense of power that our fighters simply did not provide. You could point the nose at a target and know that you carried enough firepower to destroy anything you could hit. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe pilots who attended these demonstrations revealed the psychological impact of seeing the captured American fighters' capabilities demonstrated directly. While the Zirkus Rosarius pilots could show that German fighters maintained advantages in certain flight regimes, particularly at medium altitudes, the demonstrations made clear that in terms of pure firepower, the P-47 was simply superior. The volume of fire from 8 heavy machine guns was not something German fighters could match with their mixed armament of lighter weapons and slower-firing cannons. Senior Luftwaffe officer Hans Werner, an ace with 220 victories, offered perhaps the most succinct assessment of the P-47 after viewing it at a Zirkus Rosarius demonstration. The Thunderbolt could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. But more concerning than its armor was its firepower. When those 8 guns opened fire, you faced a wall of steel. German pilots learned to respect that wall. Those who did not often did not survive their lessons. The intelligence gathered from captured P-47s included detailed performance data and armament analysis that directly contradicted some of the optimistic assumptions that had circulated in Luftwaffe briefings earlier in the war. At sea level, the P-47 achieved a maximum speed of approximately 350 miles per hour, not particularly impressive, but at 30,000 feet, the P-47 achieved 426 miles per hour, while German fighters struggled to maintain their lower altitude performance in the thin air. More troubling for German fighter commands was the recognition that American fighters were being produced in overwhelming numbers with consistent quality. Pratt & Whitney, along with Ford Motor Company, produced over 125,000 R2800 engines by war's end. Production of this single engine type exceeded Germany's entire combat aircraft engine production. American industry in 1944 produced approximately 96,000 aircraft, while Germany reached approximately 25,000 aircraft of all types. The United States produced 38,000 fighters alone. The comparison between American and German small arms production illustrated the impossible position Germany faced. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun became the most produced machine gun in history during World War II. American factories manufactured these weapons in such quantities that they equipped not only fighters but bombers, ground vehicles, ships, and defensive positions. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried 1350 caliber machine guns for defense. Each P-47 carried 8. The production volume was simply staggering. By contrast, German weapons production struggled under the weight of strategic bombing, resource shortages, and the replacement of skilled workers with forced labor. Quality control deteriorated. Manufacturing standards declined. Material substitutions became common as preferred alloys became unavailable. The gap between American and German production capabilities had not narrowed during the war. It had widened dramatically. The captured P-47s ultimately ended their service in the chaotic final months of the European War. The aircraft designated T-9+FK, originally William Roach's Beetle, was recovered by American forces at Göttingen in May of 1945, found among a collection of captured Allied aircraft that the Germans had been evaluating. Photographs taken by American forces show the aircraft still wearing partial German markings, parked alongside full 190s and Bf-109s. Lloyd Hathcock's P-47, designated T-9+LK, met a similar fate, recovered but not preserved for historical purposes. Both aircraft were eventually scrapped. The pilots' fates after capture differed markedly. William Roach spent the remainder of the war at Stalag Luft 1. He was liberated by Soviet forces in May of 1945 and returned to the United States. Lloyd Hathcock spent 11 months as a prisoner of war, primarily at Stalag Luft 3. He was the only African-American pilot among thousands of white prisoners at the camp. He was liberated by Allied forces in April of 1945 and returned to the United States, where he later played a significant role in the post-war desegregation of the U.S. Air Force. Hans Werner Lerche survived the war despite flying 125 different aircraft types throughout the conflict. His remarkable safety record of never crashing or seriously damaging a single aircraft throughout his test pilot career stands as unique in aviation history. After the war, he provided extensive debriefings to Allied intelligence services about German aircraft development programs. His memoirs, published in 1977 in German and translated into English in 1980, provide one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the German captured aircraft evaluation program. The broader lesson that emerges from the story of captured P-47s in German hands transcends the specific technical details of one aircraft type. The Thunderbolt evaluation at Rechlin demonstrated that by 1943, the outcome of the air war over Europe was being determined not by pilot skill or tactical innovation alone, but by industrial capacity applied at national scale, combined with design philosophies that leveraged that capacity. The 850 caliber machine guns mounted in the P-47's wings were not miracles of engineering. They were well-designed weapons, certainly, but conceptually simple. What made them formidable was not revolutionary technology, but rather the American willingness to install 8 of them in a single fighter despite the weight penalty, to provide 3,400 rounds of ammunition despite the volume required, and to manufacture both guns and ammunition in quantities sufficient to equip thousands of aircraft. German engineers understood this clearly. They could examine the Browning M2, appreciate its design, and recognize that German industry could theoretically produce similar weapons. But theory and practice were different things. Producing 8 heavy machine guns per fighter, manufacturing ammunition in the millions of rounds, maintaining quality control across mass production, ensuring reliability under combat conditions, these requirements exceeded German industrial capacity by 1943. The nation that could design adequate equipment and produce it in overwhelming quantities, while simultaneously producing everything else a modern military requires, would inevitably defeat opponents who produced technically superior equipment in insufficient quantities. Germany's situation by late 1943 was that of a nation attempting to compete industrially against opponents whose combined industrial capacity exceeded German capacity by factors of 5 or more. The P-47 Thunderbolt, examined in minute detail by German engineers at Rechlin and demonstrated to frontline pilots through the Zirkus Rosarius program, proved a fundamental truth about industrialized warfare. Overwhelming firepower, systematically applied through competent engineering and adequate tactical execution, would defeat more elegant solutions constrained by resource scarcity. The most powerful element in America's arsenal was not any individual technology, but rather the complete industrial system that could conceive, design, develop, test, produce, and logistically support thousands of complex weapons systems simultaneously. The captured Thunderbolts taught this lesson with undeniable clarity. German engineers measured it precisely, documented it professionally, and reported it accurately through their chain of command. But the lesson arrived too late to matter. By the time William Roach's Beetle was being meticulously examined at Rechlin in late 1943, the outcome of the war was already determined by industrial mathematics that no amount of German engineering skill or pilot courage could overcome. German ace Kurt Bühligen, with 112 victories, offered perhaps the most honest assessment of the P-47 from the German perspective after the war. The P-47 was very heavy, too heavy for some maneuvers, but in the hands of a competent pilot who understood its strengths, it was a formidable opponent. Those 8 machine guns gave American pilots firepower we simply could not match. When you saw a Thunderbolt diving at you with all 8 guns firing, you faced a stream of fire that could cut an aircraft in half. German pilots learned to respect that firepower. Many learned too late. The final irony was that German pilots understood their disadvantage thoroughly, documented it professionally, and grasped the implications completely, yet could never remedy the situation. Understanding American firepower superiority did not grant Germany the industrial capacity, the raw materials, the skilled labor, the quality control systems, and the manufacturing infrastructure needed to produce equivalent weapons in equivalent quantities. Knowing the P-47's exact capabilities did not provide the means to counter those capabilities effectively. By the war's end, P-47 Thunderbolts had destroyed approximately 3,752 enemy aircraft in 77 aerial combat. The 850 caliber machine guns that so impressed and troubled German evaluators had proven their worth in combat across every theater of the war. American pilots praised the weapons' reliability, their devastating effect, and the confidence they provided in combat situations. When you had 850 calibers, one pilot recalled post-war, you had enough gun. You didn't need to be perfect. You just needed to get close enough to press the trigger, and those 8 guns would do the rest. The story of German pilots testing captured P-47s provides a clear case study in how overwhelming material superiority, when properly applied to military aviation, could render tactical excellence and pilot skill increasingly insufficient to change the war's outcome. The Thunderbolt succeeded not because it was perfect by every conceivable measure, but because it was an effective fighter aircraft produced in quantities that made isolated examples of technical superiority strategically irrelevant. The P-47 became a symbol of American industrial dominance to German pilots who fought against it. Some referred to it simply as that 8-gun fighter, and learned through bitter experience to avoid engaging Thunderbolts in situations where the American firepower advantage was most pronounced. As losses mounted and the strategic situation deteriorated, German pilots increasingly recognized that they faced not just superior numbers, but superior firepower delivered through systems they could not effectively counter. The captured P-47s examined at Rechlin and demonstrated by Zirkus Rosarius represented more than captured enemy equipment. They represented a future that had already arrived, one in which industrial capacity combined with design philosophies that leveraged overwhelming firepower had become decisive factors in modern warfare. The 850 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in those wings delivered a lesson that German pilots would remember but could never overcome. In the arithmetic of aerial combat, 8 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously trumped more elegant solutions every time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.